In this video, we're going to look at some basic ways to use Illustrator that will also carry through into Photoshop and InDesign. One thing we could do right away is File, New Document, Command N. And we look at this basic screen that we see that comes up in InDesign and Photoshop as well. It could be similar. There's some presets here. You could look at some saved versions, some recent ones you've done, mobile setups, web setups, print. I always start off with print setups. There's obviously letters and A4s, legals, tabloid that we could look at, but we usually look at our custom area here, which is we always want to do. We always want to look at naming our files first. And then obviously if we don't know the point system, that unit of measurement, we could always switch it to anyone we're familiar with. We're going to start off with inches, and it's already 8.5 by 11. You could change up the orientation if you want it to be horizontal or vertical, landscape or portrait, whatever you prefer. Artboards we can set up now, or we could change after, which I'm going to change after. Bleeds, we could show bleeds later too. If you want to add a bleed now, or if you want to add a bleed later, you could do that. I'll show you that in a little bit as well. So we'll just create an 8.5 by 11, simple. And this is our new document. This is the artboard, it's called in Illustrator. In Illustrator, it's called an artboard. In InDesign, it's called a page. And in Photoshop, it's called a canvas. So what I have here, I'm going to Command minus, zooms out. And what I see here is this darker space you can't touch, the lighter gray space you can, and obviously the white is your artboard. Command plus brings me back in, zooming in. Command minus, zoom out. Very useful tools. Instead of having to use the magnifying glass tool here, the zoom tool, we could command minus, command plus. What I want to show you is just a few ideas of how the tools work and how some panels work and some basic functions in Illustrator. So what I want to start with is just drawing some basic shapes, and then I'm going to get into the panels. So if I just look here with my shape tool, this one right here, the ellipse tool is selected. If I right click on it, I actually get more choices here. Obviously, any of the tools that have a little triangle next to it means that there are more tools, subset tools inside that. So let me just click on this one here, and I'm just going to click and draw a shape. And what I look at first is that I can see these two here. This is the fill and this is the stroke. Let me quickly draw something. A circle. If I hold down shift, it keeps the circle perfectly circle. If I hold down option, it drags it from the middle of where I started clicking and dragging. So there's my circle. But I see my circle, it has a black stroke and a white fill. Now the white fill you can't really tell because of a white page, but if I pull it off, you can see that yes, it does have a white fill. And I could change that fill and that stroke. I click on the shape and I know that it's selected with the bounding box. I can go to my color panel or my swatch panel. The swatch panel already has a bunch of preset colors already set up for me. Let me just choose a purple here. Well, actually that's more fuchsia or whatever that might be considered, magenta. And then we have colored that stroke or that fill. Now I can see that the fill is active because it's on the front. Watch what happens when I click on the stroke. Now the stroke is in front and the stroke is active, and I can change the color of the stroke as well. Let me change that to something like that, and now it has changed. Now it's hard to tell, but it has changed the color. I zoomed in, command plus once again. But if I also go to the stroke panel, I could actually increase the weight of that stroke just by clicking on the up arrow on my keyboard. Now I'm increasing the size of that stroke, just to show you quickly how that works. Also, another way to add shapes, I could actually just click on the pen tool and just start clicking, and it uses the same stroke and fill, and I can play around with the Bezier, and now I have another shape there. This is obviously not your geometric shape. It's a little bit more obviously off. But obviously I added some points. I have a lot of different points on my path that have made that possible. And now what I can do, I'm going to change this up a little bit. I'm going to click back on the stroke. See what I did there? I also clicked on that fill there. I could also do it here, and it changes with it. And this is in the swatch panel. If I click on the fill, I can change the fill. And once again, I can click on the stroke and I can change the color of the stroke, and there we go. And now what I notice as well, the very first object I drew was actually in front, and now the second object I draw is in front of that object, and if I draw a third object, let's try a rectangle here, that becomes in front of that. That's how it works. Every other object you draw is in front of the last. So let me just change this up here to get some different colors. There we go. But what I want to show you here is arranging. And what we look at arranging, we go to Object, Arrange, Bring to Front, Bring to Forward, Send Backwards, Send to Back, and get to know these keyboard shortcuts as well. Shift, Command, close bracket, and open bracket. I'm a big fan of Bring to Front and Send to Back. So what I can do, I can take this shape here and send it behind all these by clicking on Object, Arrange, Send to Back. And now it is behind both of those objects. Or I could take this circle and bring it to the front. Object, Arrange, Bring to Front. Very important to use because in Photoshop, InDesign, and Illustrator, it all works the same. More in Photoshop, we're using layers, how we control that, but it's still very useful in that regard too. But here in Illustrator and in InDesign, this is how we do it to move things around. Another way to do this, to move things around and to align things, is to either open up the Align panel. If you don't have an Align panel open, you could always go to Window and open up any panel you want, just in case it closes, but I happen to have it open down here. My Align panel, this is the full Align panel, everything is shown. Now watch when I click on a panel, the name of it, I can close it, or close it just some, or I can close it all together. If I click on it again, it opens up all the way. I could also go to Hide Options or Show Options in the little drop-down menu for the Align panel. And here I have my Align panels to the left, center, right, top, middle, bottom. I can distribute objects with space in between properly, and there's a few other options here I could do too. But one of the most important ones, I have the Align here, but also in my Properties panel, I have all the Align options here as well. One of the most important ones to look at is Align to Selection, Align to Key Object, and Align to Artboard. Let's take a look at those. So what I'm going to do here, I'm just going to Align to Selection, and it's going to align to all three of them together as one big selection. And look what it did, it aligned all of them in line. But what I could also do is select them again, and notice with nothing selected, the Align options do not show up in your property panel. The second you select one thing, all those will show up here, the Align panel there. I could align to Artboard. So if I slightly move this off, I'm aligned to the Artboard. Now if I press center, it aligns it perfectly to the Artboard. And let's try centering it as this way as well. And now look at that, everything's aligned. Perfect. Now, if I'm slightly off and I put things over here, I can once again say just align to the artboard, and it'll automatically align to the artboard. Another way to do this is align to a key object. Let's say I want to align everything to this rectangle. I like everything to align this way. I can actually select it all, and just by clicking one more time on one of the objects, which happens to be this one, I've selected to key object, and look what happened here. It automatically aligned to key object. That's one way to do that. Select everything, click on one object you want to align to, and then press center or center, whichever you prefer, and see how it aligned to the actual object, not to the artboard or all together. So the key object is very useful as well. So you have selection, key object, and artboard, which is very, very useful. Another way I could do this, I'm going to shrink these all down just to give myself some space here. Another way to do this is to distribute the space. So I have all three. I'm going to distribute the space centered, and now because it's aligned to artboard, it aligned all my objects to the artboard but kept a perfect amount of centering between them, which is a very useful tool as well, especially when you want to create some rhythm or have something geometrically spaced out properly with the same amount of spacing. Very, very useful. So aligning shapes, arranging shapes, very important. Another way we could look around with selecting a shape, we have to look at this. If I click on the inside with my black tool, my black arrow, it shows me my bounding box, and that's great. And I can move it around. I can do whatever I want by clicking on that. And if I just click on one of these white points, I can move it around just like this, change the shape of it. But if I use the white arrow tool, the direct select tool, I can actually now click on the path and start moving individual points around and changing up, maybe even grabbing the control bars and moving and really playing around with the shape. So the black arrow tool selects the entire shape and lets you play around with the shape in with the bounding box as well. But the direct select tool lets you select the path and play with the individual points. And that's how that works. Next, we want to look at isolation mode. Accidentally, but this is a very useful tool, I can actually double click on any object and it's in isolation mode. Watch what happens when I double click on the rectangle. Everything gets grayed out, and this blue line shows up with another gray line, and it shows me I'm in isolation mode. What I'm able to do is just work independently on this particular object itself without worrying about touching any of the other objects. Nothing else can get touched except for the object that is in isolation mode. If I want to get out of isolation mode, I could double click anywhere except the object, or I can just use my arrows to go back. So once again, double click, I'm in isolation mode, double click, and I'm out of isolation mode. And now I could affect all the other objects again too. So isolation mode, very useful tool when you have many objects on your screen and you want to only play around with one. You can do a little isolation, and that works quite well. Another little useful tool I could do here as well, if I want to group all these together, right now, if I want to move these, I got to move this, then this, then this. If I want to group them all together so they move as one, I could Command G or Object Group, which also shows me Command G, which I'm going to do, group it. And now when I click on it once, all of them are selected, and I can move them around. I can scale them down properly, grab a corner, scale it. I hold down Shift and Option so that they scale proportionally and from the center. And that's group. If I want to ungroup it, I can Object Ungroup or Command Shift G, and now they're individually ungrouped again. But once again, now they're individual, harder to move around as one object. But that's okay. Grouping, very useful as well. Next, what I want to look at is the hand tool. Now, I'd never really use this hand tool here. What I'd like to do instead, especially when I'm zoomed in, Command plus, I want to use my hand tool. I press the space bar, which turns into the hand tool, and I can quickly maneuver things around. I could obviously scroll as well with my mouse, but I like the control of the hand tool. I can click and drag by holding down the space bar, and I still have access to the last tool that was selected. I don't have to click around all the tools. I just press on the hand bar, the space bar, and get the hand tool, which is very useful. Now, if we do look at the tools, we can see some selection tools. The magic wand helps me select individual colors or certain things that I'm looking for. They're very useful there. The pen tools, very useful. The text tool, very simple to use the text tool. Just click and you can start typing. By default, lorem ipsum shows up. If I want, I can click and drag, and I can do that, which I'm not a fan of. I hold down Shift, and I can drag it out proportionally. Now, this little circle here, I could double click on that circle. And now, instead of working with just the individual type, I'm working with the text box that it's in. And I can play around with even more type and how that box actually fits the text. But if I'm done with that, I could double click on the circle again. And now I'm playing around with the text inside there, not the actual text box that it's in. I can shape that up or down. Once again, I hold down Shift to keep it proportional, and I could hold down Option to keep it scaling from the middle, which is something I like to do often. If I do look at the swatch panel, I can control the colors of anything. I can add colors. If I want to add my own individual color, I could just say New Swatch. And I can select from my CMYK. I'm always a big fan of using CMYK. You could obviously use a different color mode of RGB or grayscale, but I just like to play around with adding CMYK and seeing what I could come up with. Say, okay, and there's my new swatch right there. And if we look at this little white triangle, that suggests to me that's a global color. A global color lets you use the one color. Let me show you the new color that I had. And now that it's a global color, I could actually go in, because I've changed it here and here. I can go into that global color, select it, change it, and it will change it every instance that I had that global color selected without using a global color. If I change it, it will only change it in the one area. It will not keep it change this one either, because they were not global colors, or it was a global color was not used. So global colors are very useful. I like the use of global colors. Also, if I look at the color panel, I have ultimate control over anything I want. I could choose any one of these colors, and you see the CMYK bars go with it too, which is really nice. And then you could have a new one. If you have like that color, you go to swatches and you can add that particular color, and there it is again. And there's my color added to my swatch panel. That's how you want to have it. You want to have your swatch panel ready with all your specific colors. You can get rid of these panels, or sorry, these other colors, and you could even delete colors that you don't use, select all unused, either all the unused, and I could just delete them if I want to, or maybe I could even delete the one I don't need anymore just by clicking on the trash can. There's also another way to show the colors. I could show the medium, large, small list view, which is gives you a little bit more information about each individual swatch, a little bit harder to see. But I'm a big fan of the small thumbnail view here as well. It still gives you the information when you roll over, what the CMYK value is, and all the different ones they have here for you. They already have a few set out for you, which is very nice. The next I want to show you is the gradient panel. The gradient panel is the best in Illustrator now because it's changed quite a bit. I can do a lot with gradients. If I click on the gradient tool and I click on the actual color bar that is there for me, the two colors. You at least need two colors, obviously, to form a gradient. The great thing about this is now I could actually double click on these little points here of the gradient bar and change them right here to CMYK or other options. Change the opacity. I could change it to any color right here. I don't have to click and drag colors from my swatch panel like I used to. I could change anything I want. If I want to click and add another point, I can. And here's another color I can add. And I can obviously change this one if I want to too, but for now I won't. I'll leave it alone. Actually, let me make it a little bit brighter. There we are. And now I can play around with not the direction, but well, I can play around with the direction, the opacity, the location, the angle. I can play around with quite a bit of this and move these things around how I see fit. And obviously, if I wanted to, I can get rid of the stroke just by saying no stroke. So I have my fill, I have my stroke, and I could say if I want no stroke, a gradient, or a color right away. The no stroke, this line, the red line through it means none. There's nothing there. So I just got rid of that stroke. If I want to bring the stroke back, I could just click on the stroke color and it adds it back. If I want to get rid of it, just click on the no stroke, whichever, and there's none. So that's what I'm kind of looking at there. Another great little option here is to click on this radial gradient, which is great. So I could do a few different things with the radial gradient. And I can now use the gradient tool to play around with that. Sorry, I'm stuck on the stroke. See, now the stroke has a gradient too, which is not what I was wanting to show you. See, I get the confused too sometimes when I got to click on the fill or the stroke. Click on the fill, and now I could click on the gradient. The radial. So I could have a normal gradient, just with linear gradient. I could have a radial gradient, or I could have, now the new one is a freeform gradient. The freeform gradient, very, very cool. I can move these points around, and they actually let the colors bleed into each other quite nicely. I can double click on that color right actually on the shape itself and change it. I can change it to anything I want. If I want to add another point, I can add another point. And it really lets you play around with the gradients in the best way possible. On this new way to play with it, and I can actually grow out the colors as well as much as I want. Very, very cool way to play around with gradients as well. Next, just to play around with the character panel, just want to show you the character panel, which is this T here, the type tool, but the character panel itself allows you to play around with the typefaces and fonts. So if I have my typeface here, to have it in Myriad, which is default, I can go to a variable typeface like Acumen, and I could play around with that. I could make it, obviously, the type size a little bit bigger. Oh, let me select it, sorry. A little bit bigger, a little bit smaller. It kind of plays around with you right there. 14 point. Maybe I could change the leading, which is the spacing between individual lines. I could play with the kerning, which is auto. I always love using optical. I prefer that unless I'm using script typeface. I could play around with the tracking, which will change up the spacing between all characters. The kerning changes up the spaces in between individual characters. I could play around with the scaling, which I never do. The baseline shift, which would obviously just take one particular or a few particular pieces and just change them how they are. The baseline would go up or down. And obviously any rotation, if I wanted to play with some rotation, I could play with rotation, but I don't normally do that. That's an interesting way to play with that too. I could do all uppercase if I just select it all. To select all, Command A if you want to select everything, but you do have to click inside the type, Command A, and then you can make it all capital. You can make it small caps. Depending on your typeface that you choose, you can make it superscript or subscript, underline, or strike through, which we normally don't do. That's just to play around with that, which is a very useful way to play around. Then I could play around with transparency. This is a very useful tool as well. The transparency, I could say I want it to be just a little transparent or a lot, depending on what I do there. But what I do when I'm playing with transparencies or anything with a number like that with the box, I hold down Shift in my up and down arrow keys. It brings it up to increments of 10. It lets me get somewhere a little bit quicker instead of just not holding Shift and it goes in increments of 1. So that's my transparency, and I'm going to bring it to the front just to show you that now it's in front, but you can see it's transparent, so you can see the things behind it. The transform tool, same idea. You could play around with the transform panel quite a bit. You could move things around. You can give them X, Y coordinates. It'd be very, very specific. You can play around with the width and the height. Once again, if you want to click off the change so it only plays with a certain one instead of keeping it proportional. No, I went too small there, but that's okay. I can bring it back up. Maybe not. I went too far. Let's go back with Command Z, and then I'm back. And I can play around with the angle, and I can play around with the shear. I can play around with quite a bit there. I could scale the corners or scale strokes and effects. This one's very important because if you're scaling, which means holding down the corner and holding down Shift and dragging. When you scale, if you scale the strokes and effects, that's great. If you don't scale the strokes and effects, the strokes and some effects you have will not scale with the object, and that's an important thing. You sometimes would want it to scale, sometimes you don't want it to scale. More often than not, you want them to scale together, which is a very important thing. Here's another little nice piece that we have here, the appearance panel. The appearance panel lets you see exactly what's going on with any shape you have. I click on one shape and it shows me the stroke is this color, which I can change right here. I can change, I don't have to even go to the swatch panel, the color panel. I can change it right here, and I can change up the weight of it as well if I wanted to, right here on the path, the appearance panel. I could also change it. It shows me the opacity. What's the opacity at? Wow, I could change that up right there too, which is very nice. And I can change up the fill color if I wanted to right now to anything. There we go. And I can change up the opacity individually of the stroke, and I can change the opacity individually of the fill, or I can change up the opacity individually of the entire object, which is what I showed you before, which see these numbers, they coincide together. The useful thing here to bring up the opacity or bring down the opacity of just the stroke individually of the fill is very, very important. A great way to use that here as well, which I'm a big fan of. But also very similar to this is the properties panel. The properties panel actually can almost take over quite a bit of a lot of these panels that we have open. Because if I click on an object, I automatically have options in the new properties panel to transform something, just like I had transform, so I'll get rid of transform. I can now change the fill color, so I can get rid of the swatch panel. I can get rid of the color panel. I can change the stroke and the weight of the stroke. And actually, and when I click on the word, it actually opens up that panel anyways. So I can get rid of stroke. The opacity, when I click on the name, it brings up the opacity panel, so I can actually get rid of the transparency. There's a lot you could do. The effects, it could show me some certain effects, which that's shows at a later time, but it's the exact same as opening up here. Effect, a lot of different things you could do here with effect. Let's just do a little stylize, add a little drop shadow, just to show you what we're able to do, just to preview that really quickly. And there's my little drop shadow in there. So once again, the effects are there. Offset path, recolor, arrange. There's so many things you can do right inside the properties panel, which is so, so useful. And even in here, as you saw, I had a gradient. Now I could kind of play around with that, but there's so much more you could do with the properties panel. So very, very useful to use that as well if you like that as well. Another great thing that is new to Illustrator is if you have the trim view. So you might have a lot of things that are off the artboard. Once again, you can have things off the artboard, not a big deal. I love using the space around the artboard and showing different things. But if I have this, I only want to see what's on the artboard. I don't want to see any of this outside space. What I can do is go to View, Trim View. It's such a useful thing to only see what is on your individual artboard. If I want to go back and see everything, I click off Trim View and I can see everything again. Very, very useful tool in that. Another great thing to just look at under View are guides. You could hide guides or lock guides. So if I have a guide, I'm going to open up my rulers, Command R or View, rulers. I could show the rulers, but like Command R just toggles them on and off. What I can do is click and drag from the ruler and bring in a guide. And there's another guide. And what they could do is help me line things up or place a certain thing. And I could lock the guides, go to guides, view, and hide guides, lock guides, make guides, clear guides. I could do a bunch of things with the guides. Very, very useful. But another one here is under view, smart guides. Smart guides are always on by default. Command U. What smart guides allow me to do is move things around and see what happens there when those cyan lines show up. They allow me to align things in a smart way by Illustrator recognizing that there's areas that I can align to. See how this aligns to this stroke there? And I can do that, and it kind of clicks to the path for me too, which is very, very nice. However, when you're really close and trying to get very intricate, sometimes it's very hard because the smart guides force you to go somewhere you don't want to do. If that's the case, just go to View, Smart Guides, and just shut them off. And now you can go absolutely anywhere, and none of those magenta lines, suggestion lines, show up anywhere. You just get free choice to do whatever you want. So some of the rest of these tools, what we're able to play around with, once again, where there's some lines. If I want to make a line, I can make a line and play around with that. A bunch of different options in there too. The shapes we spoke about, the brush tool, if you want to play around the brush. We're going to get into some of these other shapes, some of these other tools as well later on, but quite a few different things you could do here with the eraser tool, the scale, and rotate, shear, reshape, which is very, very useful. Sorry, that's the rotate tool that has reflect as well. A bunch of other tools that we're able to get to, the gradient, the mesh. Eyedropper is really great. I'm a big fan of the eyedropper. If there's always, you bring in a picture and you want to select a color directly from it, maybe put it in your swatch panel. What you could do, open up the swatch panel, say, you know, I really like this color in here. You select it. Oops, sorry, let me click on that first. There we are. And then I could select it. And now I actually have that color there, and I could add it to my swatch panel. So the eyedropper is very, very useful. The blend tool, we'll get into a little bit later. Symbol sprayer, column or bar graphs. The Artboard tool. Let me get into the Artboard tool really quickly. Mainly what I could do is add multiple artboards, so I could actually go to the Artboard panel, which I'm a big fan of, and just add more artboards so I have more to play around with. So if I ever wanted to say, okay, here's a poster, here's another version of a poster, another poster, another poster, I can do that. Artboards are very, very useful, and I can even change up the directions of all the artboards. I say, you know what, I don't want them to go like that, I want them to go straight down. Say okay, and now they go straight down like that. So the artboards are very useful, and with that comes the Artboard panel tool. Sorry, the Artboard tool. And I can click my own. I can just create them any shape I want, or sorry, any dimension I want, and then they appear here still in the Artboard panel. If I ever want to get rid of one, just click and drag, and one is gone. Say I still don't like this one, I'll get rid of that one is gone. And what I could do also is I could click on one, and I can move it around anywhere inside this gray space, the darker gray space there, and it has the numbers Artboard 1, Artboard 2. Once again, I could change them, and look what happens in the property panel. In the property panel, when I'm clicking on the Artboard, I can change up anything here, in the Artboard panel or the property panel always brings up options that you can see here. Either you can do some things here, or you can do them here. This just makes it a little bit quicker, but you can do always the same things here. So that usually happens with those as well. To click off of that, just go back to your black arrow, the selection tool, and you can play around. So I can't click on them anymore. I can't move them, but that's all right. So in the layers panel as well, you have all your multiple layers. So what you're able to do, if you'd like, which I strongly suggest, is only put certain things on certain layers. So let's pretend I want to put all my shapes onto a shape layer. I'm going to make a new layer, create a new layer, and I'm going to call it shape. Okay, there's my shape layer, and I'm going to grab these objects. The objects are selected. This little blue square indicates that something is selected on that layer, and I want to bring those shapes onto the new layer. That's all I have to do is click and drag this little blue square and bring it to the top layer, the shape layer, and it turns into red. And now it's suggesting that those things are on the red layer, which they are. So I could shut it off, the invisibility right there, and those things are gone. Now what's left is the type. So now I'm just going to call this the type layer, and usually we have our type on the top. So I'm just going to click and drag this layer and bring it to the top. Now the type layer is on the top and the shape layer is on the bottom. Now look what I can do. I can bring the type over top, and it's always on top. So even if I try to arrange an object, arrange send to back, well, it will not go to the back behind that rectangle because it's on the top layer. If I wanted to send it to the back, I'd have to put them both on the same layer and put it behind it, or just bring the type layer down, and now it's behind. but usually, like I said, we put the type on top because it's usually on top. So a lot of playing around, some very simple things here in Illustrator that we can do, some basic functions that are also very useful in the other programs, Illustrator and InDesign. So a lot of these things carry through in a very similar way, and I hope that helps.